Good day, all, and welcome to another episode of the Most Notorious podcast. My guest today, I am very excited to announce, is Taylor Kiland. She is a writer and ghostwriter who specializes in military nonfiction. 3 of her books are about Vietnam POWs. Her work has been featured on the NewYorkTimes.com website, the WashingtonPost.com website, NBC Nightly News, CNN, C-SPAN, and many other media outlets. She has a new book out called Murder of the Jujube Candy Heiress, a Coronado Cold Case. Welcome to the Most Notorious podcast. It is so great to speak with you.
Well, thank you for having me, Eric.
Absolutely. So this is a book that was a long time coming, right? You've been researching this case for many years.
That is correct. Almost 20 years, to be honest with you.
What was that experience like? Do you remember when you first decided to write this book? What has this 20-year process been like?
Well, I do remember exactly where I was when I heard about this case. I was at a 4th of July barbecue with some friends in Coronado, California, which for those of your listeners who are not familiar with Coronado, it is an island community in San Diego that's accessible by a bridge and also a very, very, very long causeway. So it's not technically an island, but we call it an island. And it has a lot of history, military history, Hollywood history. And I had never heard of this murder case. I was actually talking with a friend of mine at this barbecue about the fact that I was the victim of crime in Coronado. This was in 1993. And someone broke into my apartment in Coronado and stole my underwear.
Oh,
and
goodness.
that's all. Yes, and that is all this thief stole. And as far as I know, no one was ever arrested or prosecuted for this crime. And so 20 years later, actually, I guess it was about 10 years later, I was at this July 4th barbecue and we were talking about crime in Coronado. And I lamented the fact that, my crime had never been solved. And a friend of mine who was a longtime resident leaned over to me and said, "Well, have you ever heard of the cold case of Ruth Quinn?" And I said, "No, I have not." And she said, "Well, she was a longtime Coronado resident, and she was murdered in her bed in Coronado in 1975. And her murder has never been solved." So that was in the early 2000s, and I set out then to do some research, and I talked to a lot of the murder victims' friends. I talked to at least one of the police detectives who was involved in the case. And then life got in the way, and I got married and had a baby and worked on a couple of other books. And during the pandemic, I was dusting off some old files and found these files. And I said, I got to finish this book. And so, like many people during the pandemic, I had some time on my hands. And so I resolved to finish the book. And by that time, some of the people that I had originally interviewed had died. But 2 of the 3 suspects were still living. And many of the people who were living in Coronado in 1975 were still living in Coronado. And so I was able to talk to a number of people involved in the case and finish the book, which just came out earlier this spring.
Now, Ruth Quinn's Coronado, it's far different than the Coronado of today, right?
Correct. It absolutely has retained some of its charm. What changed the island the most was the opening of the bridge, which happened in August of 1969. Before 1969, this small island was primarily the domain of 2 types of people. Military officers who were either working at the Naval Air Station, as aviators or Navy SEALs who were working at the Naval Amphibious Base. So they were the primary residents, and the other primary residents were seasonal wealthy people who came to visit and stay at the Hotel del Coronado, which is this iconic Victorian era hotel, all wooden, I might add, that was built in the late 19th century. And it became kind of the playground for the rich and famous all throughout the 20th century. And anyone who could afford to came and stayed for a couple of weeks or even a couple of months. So Coronado was kind of a sleepy town, but it did have quite the active social life at the Hotel del, and it was the residence for many military people. With the building of the bridge in 1969, the island became a lot more accessible for commuters and also for a lot of people, a lot of outsiders, a lot of money. And the place has become much, much more affluent now and a lot more transient. And for a murder, the bridge offered a way for a quick getaway.
Yes, for sure. So I'm going to be honest with you here. I don't think I've ever had a jujube in my life. If I did when I was a kid, I don't remember. But jujubes go back over 100 years at least, right?
They do. They do, yes. So Ruth Quinn, who was the murder victim in this story, was the grandfather of Henry Heide, who was a German Catholic immigrant who came to the United States a few years after the end of the Civil War, so in the late 1860s. And he came to Manhattan and he started selling penny candy from a wagon that he dragged behind a horse. And he brought this type of hard gummy bear called Jujubes and introduced it to the American public. And it became wildly, wildly popular, especially as a movie theater treat. Some people thought that it could kind of help alleviate coughing, almost like a cough drop, which maybe is one reason why it initially became popular in movie theaters. He also was the first, Henry Heide was the first to sell small chocolate bars. He sold almond paste that bakers used. He became a very, very wealthy man. And Ruth Quinn was his oldest grandchild. He had 11 children, and each one of those 11 children had many children. So I call her a Jujube Candy Heiress. She was really an heiress in name only. She did inherit some stock from the Henry Heide Candy Company, but at her death, I determined that her estate was only worth about $200,000 in 1975, which was not chump change, right? But she was not worth millions of dollars. So money did not seem to be a prime motive in this murder.
Right, yeah. So she basically grew up under the shadow of this candy empire, and people assumed throughout her life that she had more money than she did. But she had lots of cousins to compete with.
She did.
Inheritance-wise.
She did, but she was raised in affluence in Manhattan. She was raised with nannies. She was raised with housekeepers. She was raised with chauffeurs. She went to a boarding school. She was sent to a private Catholic college. She did not have to work after she graduated from college. She performed volunteer work, which is what a lot of the affluent women did in the 20th century. So she was raised quite well, and most people who knew her in Coronado said that she exuded an air of affluence. She had a haughtiness about her and an attitude about her that she came from money. And quite honestly, she probably was a lot more worldly than some of the other women living in Coronado at the time. She came to Coronado because she married a young naval officer, a naval aviator who was stationed at the air station right nearby. And she had already gone on the Cook's tour of Europe, and she spoke fluent German, and she was college educated. And of course, she had been raised in Manhattan around a lot of money and a lot of society. And so she probably was, like I said, a lot more worldly and sophisticated than your average Navy wife at the time, who most Navy wives came from middle class backgrounds. So she rubbed a lot of other wives a little bit the wrong way, shall we say.
Right. Her husband was a war hero. He was very accomplished.
He was the executive officer of the USS Bogue, which was a carrier escort, and they were given an unusual mission during the Battle of the Atlantic. They were sent out into the middle of the Atlantic with very few defenses and were responsible for sinking, I believe it was 13 U-boats. And in fact, they sunk the last U-boat of the Atlantic campaign. And so he was awarded a Bronze Star. His ship received a Presidential Unit Citation, and he was on his way home and was going to be sent off to the Pacific to finish off the war in the Pacific. The ship pulled into port in Brooklyn for refueling and retrofitting. And poor Charles Quinn, Ruth's husband, comes down with pneumonia and dies in about 48 hours.
Oh, goodness. Yeah.
Yeah. And of course, this was in 1945 when he died of pneumonia. 6 years earlier, in 1939, Ruth and Charles's younger son, little Michael, was hit and killed by a truck in front of their house. So by 1945, this poor woman had lost her son and her husband.
Very sad. So one of the people in her life we haven't mentioned yet was her brother, Hank.
Mm-hmm.
And she was a mother figure, right, for Hank?
She was, yes. She had one brother, a younger brother. He was about 3 or 4 years younger than she was. His name was Hank Leyendecker. And when Ruth and her husband Charles moved to Coronado in the 1930s, Ruth's mother and Ruth's brother followed her to Coronado and moved into the Hotel Del and lived there for 20 years. Now, living in a hotel for decades sounds unusual to us, but apparently it was not unprecedented. Wealthy people sometimes lived in hotels. I would assume that it would have been pretty expensive, but it probably required, very little upkeep for them. They got 3 meals a day, room service. And Ruth's brother never married, did not serve in World War II, never worked, never held a paying job. He told everyone around Coronado that his job was to take care of his mother. And I believed he sort of served as an unofficial escort for his mother to social engagements, because it was probably in the early 20th century not very kosher for a single woman to be going out socially without some sort of an escort. And Ruth's mother was not divorced, but estranged from her husband. So Hank served as surrogate protector, I guess you could say. And when Mrs. Leyendecker, Ruth and Hank's mother, died, Hank didn't have anyone to pay for the Hotel Del anymore, so he moved into a room in a house. A couple rented a room to him, and he lived there for the next 20 years. And without anyone to pay for his meals, like he was enjoying at the Hotel Del, he ended up at his sister Ruth's house every night for dinner. And apparently he also suffered from depression. And when he was off at a dude ranch in Wyoming for the summer in 1939, he came down with a serious bout of depression, and Ruth took off to go take care of him. And that is when her younger son, Michael, was hit and killed by the truck.
So they were basically like oil and water.
That is a very good description. Yes, Ruth and her brother were definitely like oil and water. They were somewhat codependent. And like I said, Hank would spend every evening at her house. She cooked for him every night, and anytime he had a medical issue or emergency, she was the one who was always looking after him.
Yeah, you write in your book that she disliked him.
I don't think she respected him. Let's put it that way. He never worked. And when she was widowed in 1945, she went back to work. She became a librarian, and she worked for the next 20 years as a librarian.
And she had an old-fashioned librarian personality, right? Stern, shushing people.
Yes, very bookish, very educated. But most people told me she was weirdly loud for a librarian. She just had a very loud voice, not very self-aware, if that makes any sense.
Right.
So yes, in a lot of ways, she fit the stereotype of a librarian, except for the fact that she spoke very loudly.
Right. So after the passing of her son and her husband, she lived the rest of her life with two main male figures in the picture, her brother Hank and her son Chuck.
Correct.
Can we talk about Chuck? Chuck is a really interesting character in this story. He basically lived a playboy lifestyle.
Yes.
But without the money to support it.
Exactly. He did not have the millionaire fortune to support his playboy lifestyle. But yes, after World War II, Ruth was left with her son Chuck and her brother Hank, and she had to bail them out and take care of them for the rest of her life. Her son Chuck was Hollywood handsome. I mean, he was quite the looker. And he was an incredible athlete. He was pioneering in the sports of surfing and skiing. He is on record as having catching one of the longest waves in Hawaii, and it was captured on film. He was featured in National Geographic in a centerfold spread on the growing sport of skiing in the 1950s. He worked as a ski instructor and as a lifeguard. Those are probably the two seasonal jobs that he held the longest. He did go to college, and he did serve in the Navy for a short period of time. But for most of his life, he was unemployed. He tried hard to find jobs. Sometimes he could secure them, but he didn't seem to be able to hold on to them. Consequently, he was always broke. Always broke. I found letters. I found just stacks and stacks of letters that he had written her where he is asking for more money, asking for a loan, thanking her for the latest check, begging her for support for his car payment, his rent, his clothes, his vacations. He just could not make ends meet. He also had a severe drinking problem and got into a lot of trouble. The worst trouble he got into was in Tahiti. He went to Tahiti for an extended vacation and had some sort of an alcoholic mental breakdown. As it turns out, I found some of his medical records. He might have been suffering from syphilis in Tahiti. And from what I understand about syphilis is that if it goes north and gets into your brain, it can cause a psychotic breakdown. Poor Ruth was called when he was in Tahiti and had to send I believe it was $7,000. Think about this. This was in 1959, to pay for his medical bills and fly him home to San Diego. At which point, when he landed in San Diego, she had a mental institution take custody of him and incarcerate him and subject him to shock treatments.
Yeah.
Which, yeah, and they caused a lifetime of resentment for her. He also fathered a couple of children along the way, neither of whom he raised, financially supported, or even really got to know until they were adults. And he has one grandson who I believe he met once before he died. He lived a long life. He lived until last year. He was about 91 years old when he died. But he just had a lot of problems.
Yeah, he had so many issues. Car crashes, paternity suits, a lot of drama.
Mental breakdowns, yes. So you can imagine what a stress that was on poor Ruth, who was living, in a rental cottage in Coronado, living on a fixed income, her library retirement, and, the few securities that she had inherited from the Heide Candy Company. Her son was quite a stressor on her. And then her brother Hank, of course, expected to be fed every night.
She did receive periodically candy baskets, gifts from the company.
She did. Well, because she was a shareholder, she would get, quarterly reports and an annual report. And I believe those quarterly reports would also include care packages of candy.
So there's a third man who would end up being a suspect in this case, Alan Graham. Would you tell us more about him?
Sure. So Alan Graham is the third suspect in this case. Son Chuck and brother Hank being the other two. Alan Graham was a British expat who is from Liverpool and by all accounts grew up very poor in Liverpool and resorted to a life of crime, petty crime, at a very young age. He met a woman named Anne Morrison in London. And Anne Morrison was the daughter of Admiral Steve Morrison, and she is the sister of Jim Morrison, the front man for the Doors.
Right.
I don't know how many people know that Jim Morrison's father was a Navy admiral. Alan Graham marries Jim Morrison's sister, Anne, and they follow the admiral when he gets stationed in Coronado. Alan Graham comes to Coronado for the first time in the late 60s and starts work as a carpenter. But he also continues his life of petty crime that he started over in England. And Ruth Quinn hires him to repair her dining room table. And he repaired the dining room table and brought it back, but he kept coming around to visit Ruth. So here he is, a 28-year-old married man coming around to visit this 71, 72-year-old widow. Well, as it turns out, he was casing her joint. And one night when she was at the opera, he and a couple of accomplices broke into her house and stole a curio of antique cameos that were worth about $50,000. He was smart enough to realize that these cameos might be worth something. And he was caught. I believe my supposition is that he tried to pawn these cameos to a pawn shop in Los Angeles, and the pawnbroker recognized that they were stolen and called the authorities. Alan and his accomplices were arrested. Ruth testified against him, and he went to jail for a year. So when she turned up dead 2 years later, he was on the suspect list.
So as you said, Graham is a grifter. He's a crook. He's married to the sister of Jim Morrison. And Morrison, at this point, he is already dead.
Mm-hmm.
And he died with a lot of money, of course.
Correct.
Why is Alan Graham resorting to crime? Wouldn't his wife have some of her deceased brother's money?
Well, I don't think he never benefited, never inherited any of the money from Jim Morrison's money. And in fact, what's crazy about this story is that all three of these suspects were suspects in subsequent suspicious deaths. Jim Morrison left all of his money to his girlfriend, his common law wife, Pamela Corson. And 2 years later, she dies of an apparent heroin overdose. And when she dies, half the money goes to Jim Morrison's parents, and half the money goes to Pamela Corson's parents. And so, who was married to Jim Morrison's family? Alan Graham. Pamela Corson's parents were convinced that Alan had actually killed Pamela Corson. He was a suspect in Pamela Corson's death for a short period of time. But by the time Jim Morrison's parents died and the money, the estate, passed down to Jim Morrison's brother and sister, Alan Graham and Ann Morrison were already divorced. So poor Alan Graham never got any of the Doors' money.
Oh, poor Alan Graham.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it's interesting how that played out. Wasn't Morrison's money originally supposed to be split upon his death between his parents and his siblings? And then he decided instead to leave it all to Pamela Corson. But she never saw any of the money, right? Because that was all being litigated up to the point of her death.
It was being litigated. She fought hard to be declared a common law wife, even though they were not legally married. And Jim Morrison's brother told me that because she fought hard and was successful at being named his common law wife, his inheritance became marital property. And so when she died without, children, half the estate went to his parents and half the estate went to hers. And if they hadn't been considered married, her parents might have received it all.
It's a little weird, right? Here's this eccentric grifter who knew Morrison at the height of his popularity and would actually write a book about him later in life. Yet he
tried to capitalize on his brief interactions with Jim Morrison. He was never able to produce a single photo of him with Jim Morrison. I mean, there's not one in his book. I've never seen any picture of him with Jim Morrison. So it's unclear how much time he spent with Jim Morrison. He did meet him, but he claimed that he was the authority on Jim Morrison, and somehow he got himself hired as a consultant on the Oliver Stone movie about the Doors. He's a pretty clever con man.
But yeah, he decided to spend his free time hanging out with a devoutly Catholic librarian who lived an extremely modest lifestyle. As you said, he recognized the value of her cameo collection. But did he believe she had more money than she really did, do you think?
Perhaps. I mean, everyone knew that she was a Jujube Candy Heiress, but no one really had access to her bank account.
Right, yeah. So she's having issues with her son, her brother.
Mm-hmm. And Alan Graham, who's still lurking, in the alleys like an alley cat in Coronado. And in March of 1975, it's Sunday, March 16th. It was during Lent. And on this particular Sunday, as Ruth did every Sunday during Lent, she went to church twice. And after going to church the second time, she went home and she was never seen again. A friend of hers called her 4 times that Sunday night, and no one answered the phone. There were 2 young boys who were skateboarding across the street from her house, and they saw Hank walking to her house late afternoon, early evening, but they never saw him leave the house. And the reason they took note of the fact that Hank was walking to her house was because he usually drove to her house, and he had a very distinctive car, and everyone knew where he was if they saw his car. But on this particular day, he was walking to her house. And like I said, they saw him walk to the house and go inside, but they never saw him leave. Hank claims that he had dinner at his girlfriend's house on the other side of town. And then, as he was wont to do, he showed up at Ruth's house around 10 o'clock to spend the night. She had 2 bedrooms in her cottage, and not only did he have dinner there every night, but he usually spent the night there. And he said he walked up to the house, and it was very dark. There were very few street lights in this era, and very few cameras. There's a camera now on every doorbell, right? But today, but not in 1975. And he said the front porch light was not on. And he said that was strange. They had installed a porch light after the cameo theft. So the porch light was usually on. But on Sunday, March 16th at 10 o'clock at night, it was not on. He walked into the house and the TV was on, which was also kind of strange. Usually at 10 o'clock at night, the TV would not be on. He also noticed that there was some food being cooked on the stove. And it had obviously been cooking for a long time because it was dried up and shriveled, whatever was in there. He said he called out to Ruth a couple of times and he got no answer. And then he walked back to her bedroom and went over to her bed, and there she was lying on her bed. And he said he shook her a few times and said, Ruth, wake up. And he said that he thought she'd had a heart attack. So she wouldn't wake up. So what did he do? He didn't call 911. He didn't call the police. He called the family doctor, Dr. Eaton. And Dr. Eaton was beloved around Coronado. He was a neighbor of my grandparents. He was my grandparents' doctor. He was everybody's family physician. So while most people might think that it's a little strange to call a family physician, in this day and age, it probably was not out of the ordinary for him to do that. And then he called his girlfriend, and then he called his priest. Dr. Eaton came over, looked at Ruth's body, which was covered in blood. I mean, she had been shot once in the head and once in the neck. She was covered in blood. And he was the one who called the police. So when the police arrived, Hank was walking around the crime scene. His girlfriend was walking around the crime scene. His priest was walking around the crime scene. Dr. Eaton was walking around the crime scene. And Dr. Eaton's wife was walking around the crime scene. So it was not a clean crime scene.
So she was fully clothed when her body was found, right? Even wearing her shoes.
She was. By all accounts, what I believe is that she was making dinner and for whatever reason went and lay down for a few minutes. She was lying on her side, and the killer came in, took a pillow, stuffed it over her head, shot her once in the neck, which didn't kill her, and shot her once on the side of the head, which did kill her.
And one of the odd things about the crime scene had to do with a crucifix.
She had a crucifix in a little bowl by the side of her bed, and the crucifix was turned over so that the face of Jesus was not facing the killer. Somebody who was Catholic, in my opinion.
Now, the fact that she had been shot twice, that suggested right to police that this had not been a professional hit.
Correct, because it obviously took 2 shots to kill her.
Yeah, it's so interesting. Hank was there, like clockwork every night, and this was the one night he told police he was not there.
This is the one night he claimed he did not go there for dinner, that he went
Right.
to his girlfriend's house for dinner instead.
Everyone who was familiar with the siblings, they knew that Hank was there each evening.
Yes.
So if someone had been casing the house, really, really watching it, they would have known whether Hank was there or not.
Right. Well, he didn't drive there. Those 2 young boys, the skateboarders, said he was walking there. And apparently their testimony was discounted because they're minors. I tried to find both those boys, and they're both deceased.
You talked to one of the detectives who had worked the case, who was convinced that Hank was the murderer.
He was convinced. He said it looked like the sloppy job of an old man. That's the word he used to me. And he said when he brought Hank in for questioning, he tried to trip him up. He was convinced that Hank knew more about guns than he ever let on because he'd spent so many summers at that dude ranch up in Wyoming, the one where he suffered from depression and Ruth had to go rescue him. This is called the Eaton Dude Ranch. No relation to Dr. Eaton, but it was a vacation spot for the wealthy who wanted to go, pretend to be cowboys for the summer. And Hank spent a lot of summers there. And so this detective was convinced that maybe Hank knew more about guns than he let on. The police also knew that Hank had put a padlock on the second bedroom where he spent the night every night. After the cameo theft, he had put a lock on the bedroom door. So ostensibly, he could have been hiding something behind that locked bedroom door. So he tried to get Hank to admit that he knew a lot more about guns than he let on, but Hank wouldn't budge. And unfortunately, no weapon was ever recovered from the crime scene or anywhere.
Hank refused a polygraph test, right?
He did, and so did Chuck.
What was the relationship between Hank and Chuck at this point? I mean, it wasn't congenial by any stretch of the imagination.
It was not. Hank knew what a playboy Chuck was. Hank knew how much Chuck was always asking Ruth for money. And Chuck also resented the fact that Hank made his mother take care of him. Unfortunately, they were really a lot alike. And they both suffered from, mental illness. And I think because they were so alike, they recognized that in each other, and they just despised each other. There was a lot of yelling and screaming in that family among the 3 of those people: Ruth, her brother Hank, and her son Chuck. Every visit that Chuck made to visit his mom, or any visit that his mom made up to San Francisco to visit Chuck where he lived, always devolved into a shouting match and the silent treatment and a shortened vacation. They just were a very dysfunctional family.
Right.
They'd suffered a lot of tragedy. They had really suffered a lot of tragedy.
And probably didn't have the ability to work through that trauma.
Right.
So they took it out on each other.
Right. In that era, there really wasn't much to support people.
Right. So what about an alibi for Chuck?
Well, the weekend of Ruth's death, Chuck was visiting some friends up near Tahoe. And he was actually gone all day and all evening on the day of her murder. He was out either hiking or skiing with some friends. So his host could not vouch for his immediate whereabouts. The cops estimated that Chuck did have enough time to drive from Tahoe down to San Diego, commit the murder, and drive back. It was possible. But without any weapon, without any gun, even though he was under a cloud of suspicion, he was never arrested.
Had anything been stolen from the crime scene?
Nothing was stolen.
Does that rule out Ellen Graham, that nothing was taken?
Alan Graham was the only one who had a clear alibi. He was at a dinner party that night with a bunch of friends.
Did she have a will?
She did have a will, and she left everything to her son, Chuck.
So the motives would have been different for Hank as
than
opposed
they
to
were for Chuck, yes. Alan's motive might have been revenge. Chuck's might have been money. He didn't have a strong understanding of money. He may have thought that his mother had more money than she did. Like I said, she left him about $200,000, which was enough for him to live off for a little while, but it wasn't millions. And Hank, I believe his motive could have been just sheer anger and hatred at his sister. And, this case has been reopened by the cold case team in San Diego. And I did meet with them. And they said, based on what we have read about this case, it seems like a crime of passion. Someone takes a pillow and stuffs it over someone's head. It seems like it was somebody who was very inflamed and full of hatred and acted impulsively.
Did Chuck believe that Hank had murdered his mother?
No, he was convinced that Alan Graham did it. But like I said, Alan had a motive. Had an alibi.
Alan wrote some sort of a half-hearted apology, right?
He did. He wrote an apology letter from prison to Ruth, but it really wasn't an apology letter. It was clearly someone, I think it was a priest, had twisted his arm and told him to do it. But it really was not an apology.
Do you think Ellen Graham stole her cameos?
Yes. With a couple of accomplices.
So if he had robbed her and she testified against him,
He did.
helped put him away, but to go so far as to murder someone out of revenge for having to spend a single year in prison, it just seems so extreme.
It does. It does.
Now, the animosity between Chuck and Hank spilled over into the funeral. They could not make peace, even for that.
They couldn't sit in the same pew. And, unfortunately, the case went cold in about 3 weeks. They just, the cops just ran out of leads. And sadly, as I mentioned before, all three of these suspects, or weirdly, I should say, all three of these suspects were suspects in subsequent suspicious deaths. I mentioned the one about Pamela Corson, Jim Morrison's common-law wife, who died of an apparent heroin overdose, but her parents were convinced that she'd been given a hot shot, basically that someone had injected, an overdose of heroin in her. Hank also found his girlfriend dead in the bathtub a few years later. And he called the police when he found her. The police showed up and they took one look at him and they said, "You again?"
Right.
And because this was the second dead body that he had, quote unquote, discovered. And then Chuck was also a suspect in the Mount Tam serial murder case. In the late 70s and early 80s, somebody was stalking hikers in the hiking trails north of San Francisco and killing them. And he was a suspect in that case. And when a composite sketch appeared in the San Francisco Chronicle, a friend of Chuck's called him and said, "Look, I know you go hiking, and you really shouldn't go hiking anymore because you look frighteningly similar to this composite sketch." Again, there was never, enough evidence to formally arrest Chuck, and they did actually find the murderer, the serial murderer, for that case. Chuck was also the last person to see his brother alive. I'm sorry, his uncle alive. Hank was in the hospital for some surgery. He had a really bad case of skin cancer, and he mysteriously died in the hospital about an hour after Chuck had visited him. So there's just a swirl of suspicious deaths and murders that this family seems to be connected with. And sadly, there's never been justice for poor Ruth Quinn.
Now, do your readers ask you who you think murdered Ruth Quinn, or do you choose not to go there and let readers come to their own conclusions?
I do like to let the readers come to their own conclusions, and I have to tell you that I get about 30% of the readers who think that Chuck did it, 30% of the readers think that Hank did it, 30% of the readers think Alan did it, and then there's a few random readers who are convinced that it was a hitman who did it. And then, of course, there is the possibility that the murderer was someone who's never even been under a cloud of suspicion before. Perhaps it was a neighbor. Who knows? She certainly, sadly, made enemies because she just didn't seem to be a very likable person. But, she lived a quiet life. She suffered from a lot of tragedy, and she had a very sad demise on an otherwise peaceful little island. But as my good friend Margot Rhodes, who also grew up on the island with me, said, there's a dark underbelly to Coronado.
Right. Now, there was kind of a weird interaction between them a few years later, right?
He and Chuck had a conversation one July 4th, probably in the late 70s, so it was maybe like 4 or 5 years after the death. And Hank said something very suspicious to Chuck. He basically said, let's let sleeping dogs lie. He didn't seem to be interested in pursuing his sister's killer.
Interesting.
So Hank died in 1984, and Chuck and Alan Graham died in 2024.
Now, both of these guys, it was important for you to speak to them.
And I did. I had conversations with both of them.
What was your personal impression of them after interacting with them?
Well, Alan, I only talked to on the phone. He was very pompous, supercilious. He was very roguish. He was very sanctimonious. He was very unapologetic. And everyone that I know who knew him said that he was just very creepy and very much a con man, even in his later years. Chuck was a very kind of tragic figure. I went to visit him a couple of times in his apartment. He lived in a little efficiency in a Catholic retirement home south of San Francisco. And he, was living out a very quiet life, clearly on Social Security and the kindness of neighbors. And he struck me as just a sad, lonely figure.
It's pretty amazing when you think about it, that with everything he had been through, electroshock therapy, car accidents, mental health issues, breakdowns, that he lived as long as he did.
It is. I will tell you that he was successful at one particular thing, and that is his sobriety. He became sober in the late 60s, and he was sober until the end of his death. And that may have contributed to his longevity. He also was, quite an athlete and was physically active until into his late 80s. He claimed that he was still surfing and skiing into his 80s. I'm not sure if that was accurate, but he was very physically fit. Let's put it that way. But, sadly, like I said, he had this son and this daughter that he never had any relationship with and never seemed to have any interest in their lives. Didn't meet either his daughter or his son until they were well into their adulthood.
It's quite a juxtaposition, right? Candy represents childhood joy, while the family's story is dark and tragic.
Yeah.
And filled with anger and resentment.
It is.
What a contrast when you think about it, just generally speaking.
It is, isn't it?
Yeah. Well, I've really enjoyed this. I appreciate your time so much. And you do have a website where people can check out your books.
Yes.
And you've written quite a few.
Yes.
The majority of your books are military themed. What was it like for you to shift into the true crime genre?
It was a real learning challenge for me. This took place in Coronado, and a lot of the figures were military. So that was like slipping on a comfortable shoe for me to write about. But I certainly did not know much about crime scenes, police procedurals, anything about murder or crime. So that was a real sharp learning curve for me. But I did really enjoy, as I always do, the research aspect of the book. And, when you're dealing with 50-year-old memories, it is it's quite an effort to kind of track down the truth.
Well, thank you again.
Thank you
been
so
really
much
great.
for your interest, Eric.
Absolutely. Again, I've been speaking to Taylor Kiland. She is the author of Murder of the Jujube Candy Heiress, a Coronado Cold Case. This has been another episode of the Most Notorious Podcast, broadcasting to every dark and cobwebbed corner of the world. I'm Eric Rivenis, and have a safe tomorrow.